What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the new Steven Spielberg film Ready Player One, based on the novel by Ernest, Cline. As always, I'll be speaking in very broad general terms initially for anyone who doesn't want spoilers, but I should say in advance that I have not read the novel, nor was I particularly excited for the movie. And I don't want to be a wet blanket spoiling anybody's good time. I know there are a lot of people out there who are intensely fired up for Ready Player One, and basically going into this only want to see or read reviews that kind of fan the flames and get them even more fired up. This is not going to be that review, so this is an opportunity to bail out if you don't want to hear a few honest criticisms of the movie. I don't want to make any enemies here because I was not necessarily emotionally invested going into this, so I don't really have a dog in this fight. This is not going to be one of those crazy rants by an old person talking about how Steven Spielberg has robbed and murdered my childhood or anything along those lines. Because in the end, I do have a lot of love and affection for Steven Spielberg's work. When I was a kid, Steven Spielberg was basically a god. He was a household name. I mean, I came of age watching Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. in the fucking theater. And to this day, at age 41, I think Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind are two of the best movies of the 1970s. So I absolutely love and adore Steven Spielberg. And I think if you were to boil his entire career down to a few key ingredients that kind of sum up what's made him such an enduring and beloved figure in showbiz, the first words to come to mind would probably be heart, imagination, and adventure. We can have a very fun, lively debate about which Steven Spielberg movies we like the most. I know for people who are a little younger than I am, think Jurassic Park is his best. I respectfully disagree, but I totally get if people think that Jurassic Park is an absolutely watershed moment from their childhood. But when it comes to heart, imagination, and adventure, I, on a personal level, found precious little of it, unfortunately, in Ready Player One. And I think that once the Easter egg hunt for all the characters and pop culture references in this movie has been totally exhausted, it's a little bit of a Where's Waldo game, trying to figure out all the different characters in the scene. But if you remove that from the equation, you're basically left with a movie that doesn't have a soul. All the key elements of cinematic storytelling that makes so many of Spielberg's movies beloved classics are basically completely absent from this movie, and all this movie really is a giant nostalgia craze. And if this nostalgia craze encourages very young viewers to go back and watch all the different movies and play all the different games and read all the books that are referenced in this movie, that's probably a net positive. And I'd be really curious to hear any impressions from very young viewers who have not played the games, who have not seen the movies, who are just watching this movie as a self-contained experience. Because as someone who lived through the 1980s and played a lot of the games and watched a lot of the movies that are on display in this movie, I come at it from a completely different perspective. But no matter how many cameos you have from great characters of pop culture that you throw into this movie, it's not like each additional character somehow adds to a greater whole. In fact, you tend to get diminishing returns from every single character that gets added to the mix. And seeing Freddy Krueger flying into frame for somebody to blow him away has absolutely no impact on me when he's taken out of context from one of his own movies. A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my favorite childhood horror movies, and it absolutely wrecked me 100 times over. But as depicted in this movie, it's not like he brings all that emotion and all that style and all that drama from Wes Craven into this movie with him. It's basically empty, superficial fan service that's fun for a few fleeting seconds, but leaves no real lasting impact. And I won't say that I was disappointed by this movie because my expectations going into it were pretty modest. And there are a few positives I can mention, like they managed to fix Ty Sheridan's really weird long leg from the movie posters. I think we all had a good laugh at the movie's expense when that poster came out a couple months back. But all snarkiness aside, there was one ingredient that I did really like, and that was the performance by Olivia Cooke. Olivia Cooke, I've never seen any of the movies in which she's appeared before, but both as a voice actress for her avatar as well as during her live action scenes in this movie, I think she's the best thing this movie has to offer. Ty Sheridan is basically a relatively attractive guy in desperate search of a personality. How he got a starring role in a Steven Spielberg movie is a total mystery to me. And the rest of the cast is basically just showing up, having fun, cashing their checks, because there's not really any real characterizations of any kind throughout this entire movie. It's a lot of very thin, one-dimensional characters voiced by people like T.J. Miller and Simon Pegg. And I would argue that T.J. Miller and Simon Pegg are outright bad in this movie. Mark Rylance, who's one of the best actors alive today, he's terrible in this movie. Like, there are a lot of really good actors in this movie who deliver some of the worst performances of their career. So suffice to say, I did not enjoy the movie. But if I were in a particularly forgiving mood, I would say this movie does tackle one element of gaming culture that works pretty well. In gaming, there's an incredible camaraderie between people who are total complete strangers who never see each other in real life. I spent many years inside the World of Warcraft, and inside that game, you're often teaming up with groups of 10, 25, or 40 people to accomplish certain objectives. And if you spend a couple of years on a particular server, you get to know a lot of these people incredibly well, even if you only know them by their gamer tag. Like my character in World of Warcraft was Colbrax, and everybody thought of me as this Tauren warrior who was a great tank in raids. And there were a few friends that I met online that ended up meeting in real life, and we've actually maintained lasting friendships in the couple of years since I retired from playing that game. But the main heroes of this movie come from all different ages and backgrounds. But when it comes to playing the game, they're kind of an unstoppable fighting force. So that's definitely something the movie did pretty well. But if you're still with me at this point, you're probably interested in hearing some specific spoilers or things that I disliked about the movie. So I'll just say the movie was not for me, but if people love the book and love the movie, more power to you. I'm not here to destroy it. I'm not angry at the movie because I wasn't emotionally invested going into it. But as somebody who's spent their entire life watching Steven Spielberg movies, I think it's very clear that at this point in his career, he's much more interested in history than in pop culture. He probably was just a poor fit for the material. They probably should have had some 25, 30-year-old pop culture crazed fiend who really is obsessed with the 1980s. Steven Spielberg was one of the engineers of the 80s. He created some of the most enduring classics of the 1980s, so bringing him in for a nostalgia trip to the 1980s was probably a poor choice. But I think I've beat around the bush enough at this point. Let's talk about some spoilers. So if you're not familiar with the basic premise of this movie, it takes place in the future where the world is basically a pretty mean, ugly place, and most people seek refuge and entertainment and basically any sort of sense of purpose in their lives by going into this virtual environment called the Oasis. The person who designed the Oasis left a few keys inside it, and whoever finds those 3 keys first will basically unlock the ultimate Easter egg and allowing them to inherit the Oasis, which at this point is the most powerful economic force in the world. There's a rival corporation that's employing an army of gamers that's desperately trying to complete the quest first so they can basically engage in a hostile takeover of this company. And meanwhile, there's an underground resistance or revolution of people who are desperately trying to prevent this from happening. And along the way, Wade, aka Parsifal, played by Ty Sheridan, he meets and falls in love with Artemis, aka Samantha, and they team up with Wade's little clan of gamers in order to try and prevent the Oasis from falling into the wrong hands and corrupting everything that gives it meaning. But the thing that I found most shocking about this movie is how unexciting it was no matter what was happening on the screen. I mean, there are scenes with like giant wrecking balls swinging through cars and King Kong leaping from building to building. You have the Iron Giant taking on the Mechagodzilla. In theory, it should be the wet dream of any fanboy who loves all these characters and franchises from the past. But it reminded me a little bit of the problem sometimes that comic books can have when you have these giant company-wide crossovers with a lot of things happening. But in the end, there's not really like a beating pulse to the story that lures people in. Every once in a while, one of these giant mega crossovers at DC or Marvel will really hit a home run and people fall in love with it and will talk about it for generations. But this movie has a ton of action, almost none of which actually brought a smile to my face, and certainly no outright excitement. One of the most overt problems that I noticed it very early on when I saw the first trailer is that the faces of the avatars in this movie are an absolute mess. When you're dealing with virtual environments, very expressive, interesting faces are absolutely essential. It's one of the things that really hurt the game Mass Effect Andromeda. When Mass Effect Andromeda came out, the faces were so messed up, they basically had to do a patch to fix it. Problem is, this is a movie, not a game, and they can't just do a little patch and then have everybody be satisfied. The 3 main characters, H, Artemis, and Parsifal, they all look terrible, and it's really hard to be engaged with characters when you think their faces look completely ridiculous. I mean, throw a rock at any video game on the PlayStation or the Xbox on the computer, you're probably going to find better game design than you see in this movie. Another problem that was nagging at me the entire movie is that while I was watching it and I was seeing all these incredible gaming virtual environments on display, I just kept thinking I'd much rather actually be playing a video game. Far Cry 5 launched 2 nights ago, or last night, 2 nights ago, and I've barely had a chance to play it yet, and I'm dying to sink my teeth into it because I thought the Far Cry 4 was fucking incredible. But if you're accustomed to gaming and you see a gaming experience in a movie and you don't have actually any control over the characters, it can be an incredibly frustrating, boring experience. So much of this movie feels like a movie about virtual environments and gaming made by really old people who actually don't play video games. What's strange is that the scenes that actually impacted me the most are very simple. There's a scene where the 2 heroes, Wade and Samantha, go to a club inside the Oasis. They have a nice little moment where they play some music from Saturday Night Fever and they start dancing together and they start kind of flirting and rubbing and kind of just enjoying each other's company. And they actually have some nice chemistry and there's some nice emotion there. But it's absolutely baffling to me that you can have action scenes that take advantage of ingredients from every... Sorry, if you're hearing all this honking, I live in New York and there's something going on in the street and it's just, it's very distracting. But it's absolutely baffling to me that you can have battle scenes that can cherry pick from any kind of pop culture imaginable, whether it's from John Boorman's Excalibur to Chucky from Child's Play, and they just seem like meaningless diversions and distractions as opposed to actual action sequences. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that the plot is just very thin, very weak, very superficial, very obvious. I don't know how many movies I've seen where you see a band of rebels teaming up to fight an oppressive corporation. But if you're going to go with that kind of framework for a story, you better find a way to inject some fresh twists and some new life into that scenario. There's an almost complete, total, alarming lack of originality or creativity at any point in this movie. Sorry, more cars honking outside. This is ridiculous. They must not like my Ready Player One review. They must be fans. Another detail that I found interesting is that the person next to me in the theater was on his phone the entire movie. He was constantly scrolling and checking. He would watch for 30 seconds, check for 5, watch for 30 seconds, check for 5. And it's one of the situations... This is completely insane. But it's one of these scenarios where there are so many people on my row on their phone and so many people behind me talking that it wasn't even worth it to try and tell people to behave and actually watch the movie, because I knew I was absolutely in the minority in terms of actually wanting to watch the movie. But what I noticed is that this idiot who's on his phone the entire movie, he was actually really enjoying it. He was giggling and smiling and laughing at pretty much every single pop culture reference. And that basically tells me all I need to know about the audience for this. And this might be the last time I'm willing to spend money to go to a Regal theater. Alamo Drafthouse has a strict no phone policy, which they will enforce. They will eject people from the theater with no refund. So I think I'm just going to have to go to the Alamo Drafthouse, even though it is a little further away from this point onward. But just so this video is not completely negative, I don't want it to sound like some mean old man saying, "Get off my lawn." Here is my hope for this movie. My hope is that I'm not the only person who sees through the superficial thrills of what this movie has to offer. For a couple of years now, I've been getting increasingly bored by this insane 80s nostalgia craze. I totally get how shows like Stranger Things cash in on 80s nostalgia and get people really fired up. But if I want to enjoy the 80s, I'll just go back and watch John Carpenter movies or David Cronenberg movies or Paul Verhoeven movies. I'm perfectly capable of watching the great classics from that decade. But there are way too many shows and movies these days that are basically sucking on the teat of the creativity of the past. 2018 desperately needs franchise to call its own. I mean, look at the success of a movie like Black Panther. Granted, the character's been around since the 1960s, but no one had ever seen a movie like Black Panther before, and I think at this point it's made $1.2 billion worldwide. And in terms of domestic box office, I think it's the most successful superhero movie ever released in America. And while there are a lot of ingredients that went into making that movie a success, I think a large part of that is that it gave us something we'd never seen before. And in Ready Player One, there's nothing you haven't seen before. Every single ingredient is familiar from the past. And I just think this nostalgia craze is played out at this point. If you look at any point in time, you'll find different nostalgia crazes for different eras. Like in the early 70s, there was a giant 50s nostalgia craze, and with movies like American Graffiti. But at this point, I'm totally ready for the 90s nostalgia craze to come knocking at our door. There are plenty of good movies and plenty of good songs and novels and video games from the 90s that are totally worthy of getting nostalgic about. I love and adore the 80s. I enjoy the 80s from age 4 to 14, but I'm ready for some new experiences, and Ready Player One was just definitely not one of those. So let me know what you think about Ready Player One. Let me know if you think I'm totally off base. I had a little bit of a cold going into it, and so maybe just that little bit of fatigue from the sickness negatively impacted my viewing experience, but I'm going to have a really hard time convincing myself to revisit this movie, whereas I'll probably continue to revisit Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Jurassic Park, Empire of the Sun. I'll continue to revisit all these movies for the rest of my life. So if it didn't completely alienate you with my negativity for this review, please consider giving my channel a subscribe. I would really appreciate it. If you want to talk more, leave a comment in the comments below, or just give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax. But if you're a fan of the novel, or you're just plain fired up to see the movie, do not let me dissuade you, and do not let me be a wet blanket on your enthusiasm. This is just one person's opinion. But thank you so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to y'all soon.